I've played a lot of Final Fantasy for a long time, with Final Fantasy VII being what really got me into the series and expanding my playtime through other entries as well, mostly focusing on 4, 10, and 12. Now, I've tried other entries in the series, and most of them haven't interested me as much as the ones I've mentioned already. Even an entry like 9, which I believe is universally praised, has unfortunately eluded me throughout my life. For a good portion of my life, I was never into MMOs or massively multiplayer online games. I never knew how to really be good at them. I didn't enjoy the excessive grinding, but I was interested in the multiplayer component. I played a lot of Ragnarok Online casually, mostly on private servers, and tried games like Star Wars Galaxies and Guild Wars, but I was young, impatient, and ultimately dropped all of these games before getting invested in them. Even starting World of Warcraft during the Burning Crusade era, I couldn't manage to know that an endgame even existed, and I doubt I even saw my first dungeon. However, there was one MMO that at least struck a chord with me. Because of my affinity with the series, Final Fantasy XI really interested me. The settings, characters, races, and classes all fit within the themes of the series and made me want to at least attempt getting into it. 11 is a fairly open MMO. It definitely leaves a lot to the player to learn, and it was unfortunately the same situation I had experienced multiple times already, where I felt overwhelmed and ultimately uninterested in playing it after a small amount of playtime. Fast forward a couple of years and Final Fantasy XIV is announced, a new MMORPG using features and settings from past Final Fantasy entries while also bringing something new, and I thought for sure that this was going to be it. I was older and better able to grasp the concepts of an MMO and what made them fun to play and grind through. I figured if there was any MMO that was going to help me understand the concept and finally see the end game of a genre like this, it would be 14. Unfortunately, that too was not the case. 14 was, in my opinion and in the grand scheme of things, considered a flop. While I can look back on it and 11 and see certain sandbox elements and intricacies that I can better appreciate, it definitely wasn't for me at the time, and I think it wasn't for a lot of people as well, considering how fast it went down, having released in 2010 and shutting down in 2012. But this series of videos isn't going to focus on Final Fantasy 1.0 because there's so many videos that already either convey the story, the mechanics, the development history, or everything involved within that point of the game's lifespan. Instead, I want to focus on Final Fantasy XIV 2.0, A Realm Reborn, and all future expansions, patches, and releases. That's because once 2.0 was announced and released was when I felt I could actually hunker down and make it all the way to max level, make it to the end of the game, experience the final dungeons and bosses, maybe even try raiding, and I did, even though I hated it. A Realm Reborn was a completely different design concept, one much better at guiding you through the steps of what makes an MMO an MMO. Most people will call it an amusement park MMO and consider it a detriment, and we'll get into that later, but I truly believe that my experience with 14 has helped me better understand more broad aspect MMOs out there and better appreciate them. This series of videos will focus on the design and development of each major expansion within the series, as well as the post-game patches, the ones that lead to each future expansion. We'll look at the base content added, extra story quests within patches, dungeons, classes, and much more. This is not about the story of Final Fantasy XIV, but the history of the game as a whole. A Realm Reborn was a true marvel. It was what introduced me to really investing in MMOs, and I can still play it today after 7 to 8 years. So hopefully you'll enjoy this ride through history with me as we talk about one of my favorite games of all time. If you enjoy these videos, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. A lot of work and research goes into these videos, and every little bit helps. And if I get anything wrong or you feel I missed anything important, please feel free to let me know in the comments so I can make corrections. Finally, keep in mind that these games have what feels like an endless amount of content. While I plan to go over major points and additions, there will always be something that falls through the cracks. With that out of the way, I'm Super Rad, and this is the history of Final Fantasy XIV 2.0, A Realm Reborn. Hey guys, really quickly, I just want to say that I am now partnered with Advanced GG, which is a gamer supplement brand. The thing I like about them most is that their flavors slap and they do not put in any filler. All of the ingredients are listed on the back of their containers and they are fantastic flavors. This one here is the Focus brand Strawberry Lemonade. Helps me when I'm making videos like these. If you guys want to support me and the channel, you can actually go and buy their products to try them out using my link that you can find in the description down below, and use my code SUPERRAD to get 10% off. The launch of Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 was a rocky one. Wasn't great. The game was both a critical and financial failure, leading to a lot of development hiccups and problems along the way, ultimately leading to an extended free trial type experience that lasted all the way until the game's demise on November 11th, 2012. The game was openly branded a failure by Square Enix themselves, but this video isn't about the life and death of the original Final Fantasy XIV, but rather about Naoki Yoshida and how he was brought on to take the reins surrounding the MMO and breathe new life into it and attempt to address many of the criticisms the game had during its initial release. Would you believe me if I said Tactics Ogre was the reason for Final Fantasy XIV being around today? A Japanese RPG created by Yasumi Matsuno was the catalyst for many different strategy RPG series, including Final Fantasy Tactics, but Naoki Yoshida was specifically engrossed within the series to the point of setting a goal to enter the video game development industry in order to one day develop a game alongside Matsuno. Yoshida joined the game development industry in 1993, starting work at Hudson Soft before becoming an employee at Square Enix in 2004, where he mostly focused on the Dragon Quest series, particularly Dragon Quest X early on in the game's development lifespan. He was soon taken off of this series by company president Yoichi Wada in December of 2010. By this point, Final Fantasy XIV was essentially on fire, and it was to become Yoshi's job to rally the team behind it and create something new from the ashes. Yoshi was a man with a lot of MMO experience, playing similar games as far back as Ultima Online, and used this experience to discuss with his new team and come up with ideas that would fulfill his role in creating a Realm Reborn. He specifically worked with the team to create additional content during the 1.0 period, a period in which the monthly subscription service was halted, hence the free trial. Within these upcoming patches and the roadmap to 2.0, it was the goal of his team to create content and features that would offer the Final Fantasy feeling one would expect from a traditional entry within the series. During this time, there was often a lot of talk about when the subscription service would be reinstated, with mixed messages between the development team and the audience, making it seem like the subscription service wasn't a priority. However, even before the release of 2.0, the team planned on reinstating the subscription service with patch 1.22. This left a bad taste in a lot of players' mouths, as many were worried that the focus was more on making money via subscription services than focusing on making good content for the MMO and the longevity of its lifespan. And you can see now, obviously, that a lot of love and experience went into the development process. Many players credit Naoki Yoshida as the savior of Final Fantasy XIV, most referring to him simply as Yoshi P. The game has been a financial and critical success, and many of his features that were stewing around even before the closed beta had ended are still major staples in the game today. An example of this would be from a DualShockers interview during said closed beta, where Yoshi P mentions a Coliseum and Frontlines experience for PvP, which were worked in later as the Wolves Den and Frontline respectively. To its strength, the team even designed the game to release on PS3 with special hotbars designed around players that would be using the gamepad instead of mouse and keyboard. In an interview discussing the game's release on PS3, Yoshida mentions three key pillars regarding improvements between 2.0 and 1.0, those being regaining the trust of players, fundamentally rebuilding the game experience, and completing the PS3 version while adhering to graphical and play quality. Every single aspect of the game had to be rebuilt for its re-release on PS3 and PC, allowing players to see it as its own new experience and release. Even before release, the development team was already working on the first patch, patch 2.1, to bring in the previously mentioned PvP and a new housing system, with new content expected to release every 3 months as a way to reason and and incentivize the subscription service. During all of its development leading up to the game's official release, the PS4 and the PS4 edition of the game were also in development, with the development team planning on utilizing the upgrade in hardware to offer a better experience to console players. Needless to say, Final Fantasy XIV's resurrection was strong out of the gate, with a positive response from new and veteran players that tried the closed beta. Yoshida's charisma and experience allowed him to create a successful roadmap for the series, and I think you're going to see that. To start things off, we're going to look over the initial 2.0 release and what that brought to the table. We'll then move into 2.1 to 2.5 and see what was included in each of those major patches, as well as the minor patches within them. Let's get started. I believe that to understand the game as a whole, where players go, what they're doing, and how they're doing it, it's important to have a basic understanding of the setting that the team created. This isn't going to be storyline heavy, but rather an outline of the world of Hydaelyn, specifically the region known as Eorzea, and the continent of Aldernard within it, as well as some subcontinents. This is the main location that A Realm Reborn takes place in, and generally where the player will be traversing through during their time within the game. The game starts off broken into 3 major areas that the player will be exploring, including the Black Shroud, Thanalan, and Lenoskia. Both the Black Shroud and Thanalan are located on Aldernard, while Lenoskia is on the subcontinent Vildebrand. Each of these locations houses a major city-state, and within each city-state are multiple guilds that relate to specific classes seen within the game. Not only that, but the cities also house their own form of armies known as Grand Companies. A player's starting class will dictate which of these 3 major regions that they start within and spend the majority of their early levels. The Black Shroud is a large forest area that acts as a natural defense against anyone looking to attack the area's main city-state, New Gridania. In the original release, the area was fairly constricted with many narrow pathways, but was later redesigned in A Realm Reborn to be more open and explorable. It houses the guilds for archers, lancers, and conjurers, as well as leatherworkers, carpenters, and botanists. We'll get into just what all of these classes are later, but just know that choosing one of the 3 former classes I mentioned will lock you into Gridania for the first early hours of the game. The city-state also houses the Grand Company known as the Twin Adders, which is run by Elder Seedseer Kane Senna. Kane is essentially the communicator between civilization in the Black Shroud and the elementals that live within the deeper parts of the forest. Now, Thanalan is an arid land with large flat areas surrounded by cliff sides. It's generally thought of as kind of a desert, but has more areas and character to offer than simply that. There's plenty of geographical diversity in the area, from pure desert locales to savanna areas and lush oasis. From 1.0 to 2.0, the design of Thanalan didn't change very much, but it did kind of shift how popular it was among players. In the original release, Thanalan was a central location that connected to the rest of the game, and where people would generally suggest players started. However, with multiple reworks and how city-states are chosen, and the teleportation system as a whole, it really dropped in popularity as a hub area for the greater population of the game. That being said, Ul'dah is the city within Thanalan and is considered a commercial hub, leading to a lot of heavy politics within and complicating how it's run in comparison to the other 2 city-states. Officially, Sultana Nanama Ul'namo is the head of state, with Roban al-Din, the general of the Ul'dah Grand Company, the Immortal Flames, but the city is more run as a collective under the name The Syndicate, which is made up of multiple officials, all with their own wants and desires that lead to conflicts regularly, and some major ones seen within the plot of A Realm Reborn. Additionally, Ul'dah houses the Gladiator, Pugilist, and Thaumaturge guilds, as well as the goldsmiths, weavers, alchemists, and miners. Now, Lenoskia is mostly made up of sweeping grasslands across the coast. This naturally makes the perfect location for a port city, and that's exactly the purpose of the city-state Limsa Lominsa, where, and I'm sorry for how I pronounce this, Admiral Merlwib Blowhiswin leads the Grand Company Maelstrom Command, which functions as a navy. I believe at the moment this is the most popular city to hang out in, despite its incredibly complex nature, with multiple narrow branching paths as well as its vertical nature thing that it's got going on there. This is due to the aetheryte that the player will teleport to when fast traveling to the city being right beside a market board, something utilized for selling items to other players throughout the game. Lenoskia houses the Marauder and Arcanist guilds, as well as the Blacksmith, armorer, culinarian, and fisherman guilds. On top of these 3 major areas, there's multiple sub-areas around Aldernard that the player will explore, including Mordona and Coerthas. Coerthas specifically is a snow-filled land and houses a city-state of Ishgard, which players don't actually travel to until the game's first expansion. Mordona, on the other hand, has no city-state and is more a barren wasteland due to a battle between dragons and the Garlean Empire 15 years ago before the game takes place. Now, if it feels like I threw a lot at you there that hasn't been explained yet, that's understandable. Things like the Garlean Empire and Aether as a whole, I'll explain now to help better explain future topics later. You can think of Aether as a type of energy. It's the source of magic within the realm of Eorzea and is utilized heavily by player characters for their classes as well as many NPCs throughout the game. It's also the source of the elemental cycle within the game, which explains how elements come to be and their polarities between one another, etc. However, one of Aether's more common uses is in the creation of Aetherites, which are physical manifestations of dense etheric mist attached to ancient machinery, allowing the ability to teleport. Players can attune to these Aetherites and use them as fast travel hotspots, with miniature Aetherites appearing within city-states to make traversal through said areas faster. In the original release, teleportation was incredibly taxing on the player due to it requiring a form of special currency known as anima, something that could only be regenerated every 4 hours. The player would start with 100 anima and spend it as they traveled, but the cost could be anywhere from 1 to 6 per teleport, meaning it could be very easy to run out and find yourself unable to travel. A Realm Reborn removed this mechanic completely, only referencing anima in later expansions. Instead, now there's a teleport cost of gil based on the distance that the player wishes to travel, and there are multiple ways to lower this cost, such as setting a location as a home point or a favored destination. As I mentioned previously, there are multiple uses for Aether, including magic. However, on the far north continent of Ilsabard is the region of Garlemald, and the home of the Garlean Empire. You can think of them as one of the more overarching and persistent antagonists within the game. While there are many antagonists or many plot points or scenarios throughout the expansions, they often all come back to the Garlean Empire in some capacity. Their main thing is that they don't have the ability to manipulate Aether, leading them to become a superpower through a special type of technology known as Magitech, and allowing them to push their goals of global conquest. Essentially a superiority complex mixed with a lot of prejudice, leading to lots and lots of conflicts between them and the other races of Eorzea. Very racist. Speaking of races, now is the perfect time to talk about what was available within A Realm Reborn's release. In 2.0, there are 5 main races for players to choose from, and within those 2 races, there are generally 2 subspecies for further customization. Potentially one of the more generic options to choose would be the Hyur, which are essentially the human option of Final Fantasy XIV. You could call the Hyur race the face of 14. Generally, a mid-lander Hyur male is depicted as the Warrior of Light, and even reappears in-game with this depiction, although called the Warrior of Darkness. We'll get into that later. Probably. It's storyline specific, it doesn't matter too much. Midlanders are said to favor settling in low-lying regions in comparison to their Highlander counterparts. Generally, Midlanders are slimmer and smaller in comparison to the bulky muscularity of Highlanders. Next is Makote, a cat boy slash girl race designed around being as ERP friendly as possible. Don't ask me what that means. The cat boys are slim and relatively hairless, while the cat girls are, cat girls. This race comes with its own 2 subspecies, those being the Seekers of the Sun and the Keepers of the Moon. Basically just one race that prefers the sunlight and one that prefers the dark. I feel like this is a good point to mention that these backstories and settings won't actually really affect anything for you gameplay wise. The main difference between picking a race and subspecies is just some of the character design options and how they're going to look overall. Fun fact, I am currently playing my own catboy character, but it wasn't the first race that I started with in the game. No, I actually spent the majority of my early game years playing a race we haven't mentioned yet, but the game does offer a system to change your character's overall appearance and race in the form of a Fantasia potion. You get a freebie at the end of 2.0's main scenario quest, but you also can buy more using those, big real life dollars. your money, your real money. Elezen, or Elezen, I never knew how to pronounce it, are the elf race in the game. They're one of the taller races that look like they have awful posture, and I have no idea why anyone plays them. There are some really cool NPCs in the game though, and plenty that make a big impact on the story. There's Wildwood and Duskwhite as subspecies, but the differences are fairly minimal from what I've seen. Rogadin would be, you know, your orc race, but I feel like they actually have a lot of character within 14. There's the Sea Wolves, who apparently lived lives as pirates before becoming the dominant race within Limsa, and the Hellsguard, which frequent more so around Ul'dah and generally act as mercenaries. Finally, there's the Lalafell, the main race I started the game on. They're a short race. It's, you know, the short trope that you see in many MMOs, but they're not without their charm. I was always really drawn into playing as a little dude wielding a giant axe, and they're honestly just really cute. They come in Plainsfolk and Dunesfolk varieties, with Plainsfolk residing more around Limsa and Dunesfolk around Ul'dah. Now, these aren't all the races and subspecies really. Like, I believe Garleans count as their own race, and characters could even be special subspecies, like Kane Senna is a Heer, but a special subspecies known as Padjal or Padhal or something. There's also an antagonist race known as Ascians or Asians that are like super magic wizard dudes who worship a deity known as Zodiark. For ease of understanding, Zodiark is a bad, evil, dark crystal, and Hydaelyn is both the planet you reside on and the goddess that you kind of worship and work for. It's weird and confusing, and there's a reason I'm not going deep into the storyline in this video, but the Aegeans or Ascians or whatever play a huge role within the setting of this game, and you actively combat them. One of the big early aspects of them is how they teach the beast tribes of Eorzea how to summon primals. Beast tribes are other races in the game, non-playable ones that could either be opposition towards the player or potentially work with them. As tribes, they worship specific primals, and the primals in this game are essentially summons we have seen in previous Final Fantasy entries. In 2.0, the three main primals that are interacted with are Ifrit, Garuda, and Titan, and all three act as bosses that the player will have to fight in some capacity in order to progress through the main scenario quest of the game. To help aid the player in these endeavors, there's many characters they'll meet along the way, some of the most important being the Scions of the Seventh Dawn, which consist of NPC characters that may last throughout the entirety of the series. Led by an incredibly important but boring plot character, Minfilia Ward, this is the main good guy team that the player works with on top of being backed by the grand companies of Eorzea. It consists of many individuals and goes through multiple shifts in both locations and how the group operates. The key characters within the group include Thancred Waters, Y'shtola Rule, Yida Hext, Papalimo, Totolimo, Urianger, not Urianger, it's not Urianger, it's your Urianger for some reason, Urianger Oguralt, and Alphanod and Alice Levelier. I won't go into too much detail about them specifically, and there's many other characters that come and go throughout the series, but these are most definitely the most prominent NPCs that assist the player throughout the game and its expansions. I'd also be remiss to not mention Tataru Taru, who is potentially the Lalafell with the most overall character development. She doesn't actively fight with the Scions, but does a lot for them and is just one of the best characters in the game. You know, just trust me on that. You'll see. Now, I think this gives you an idea of what we're working with here, at least at a very basic surface level. Final Fantasy XIV was set up like any potential MMO. It had a conflict and history built into it that helps feed into the stories and has many threads that can either be developed slightly over time or completely later in order to help add and expand the universe for when expansions or story patches are necessary. Some things that you see in the base game or even in the first expansion might later become the entire focus within an expansion years later. The world of Eorzea was set up to have basically limitless possibilities in where the storyline could go, and this gives the developers a lot of freedom in setting up plot points. But now that we have a basic understanding of the world and plot, let's start to dive into the core content and gameplay features seen within the MMO. I'll be breaking these up by their major patches. Each entry or expansion generally has its base release, meaning A Realm Reborn is 2.0, Heaven's Word is 3.0, then there's 4.0, 5.0, soon to be 6.0, etc. for all major expansions. However, within each of those releases, generally you will see major patches that include storyline content that help build towards each new release. There's generally, if not always, 5 major patches, meaning we'll be looking today at 2.0 to 2.5, which will lead us all the way up to the end of A Realm Reborn and right before Heaven's Word, where the next video will pick up. That's right, I'm not covering the entire history of this series in one video. This script as of writing it is already 8 pages, and I'm expecting it to be much longer. 2.0 will obviously have the most content to go over as it sets the groundwork for the entirety of Final Fantasy XIV, but each patch will be much more condensed in the amount of content that gets added. Before we get into the core gameplay, there's a lot of social aspects and little features in 2.0 that I want to go over. One of the main early aspects of non-level grinding was advancing through the ranks in your chosen Grand Company. Regardless of where they started, players could choose one of the 3 major Grand Companies and progress through them in order to raise the rank and gain a currency known as company seals for buying various goods. In fact, this was the main way players would unlock chocobo licenses, which, other than providing one of the first mounts, would also unlock the companion mechanic for you. Chocobo companions could be summoned by using Gissel Greens for a limited period of time and were generally used when soloing content in non-instanced areas. They can even gain skill points as they level that can be allotted into 3 different trees, those being Defender, Healer, and Attacker. Generally, you'd want to focus on a single tree that complemented your main class while progressing. While Grand Companies existed for players to feel like they were part of something bigger within Eorzea, free companies existed to fill a large social aspect in the game with its own set of rewards. These were the player-created guilds of 14 and allowed players to come together to rank up their guilds and gain rewards in the process. The biggest advantage of being part of a free company outside of the social dynamic was that there were several boosts that could be activated to make progression that little bit easier. For example, players that were progressing through the game and needed help leveling up could really make use of the Heat of Battle action, which could be activated for all FC members and boosted battle experience. And there were multiple other actions the free company leaders could activate as well. Ranking up a free company was done simply by members participating in, pretty much anything and just playing the game. There are even company chests scattered throughout each city that allow players to access a public inventory for their free company, and permissions for said inventory are customizable. Continuing on the social dynamic, players could create link shells which acted as private chat rooms. These could be freely created by any individual and allowed them to invite whoever they wanted. However, there is only enough room per player for 8 link shells total, with each link shell hosting 128 potential people as of Shadowbringers. This might have been a different number early on, but I couldn't really find anything on it. There's even an inn in each major city-state that players can enter that acts as their own private room and board. The main benefit of this area early on in the game's lifespan was that it allowed people to log off within its confines and earn rested EXP, which was bonus EXP that players could earn by logging off within this area, basically a reward for taking a break from the game without actually punishing the player for playing too long. Within the 3 major towns, players can find retainer vocates, who will allow the player to create up to 2 retainer characters for free. These characters act as storage units but have more functionality than just that. To sell things on the market board, which is essentially a global auction house for players to make gil on, they must give said items to their retainers and tell them how much to sell it for. On top of there being fees for selling items this way, the location of the retainer will also determine the amount of tax the purchaser must pay. Retainers can also be given a specific job, then go out on different types of ventures, which essentially act as timed excursions that can provide various rewards. It's a way of giving the player something to look forward to over time without them really needing to do anything. Retainers can even level up their class, just like the player, by completing these ventures and earning EXP. However, a retainer can only reach the maximum level that a player has reached on the same class. If you want your retainer to reach max level as a warrior, you're going to have to do the same first. Back to the market board, I feel like it's necessary to quickly touch on the culture of market selling slightly. Players come in all shapes and sizes. Some are more lazy or just less caring about their wallet than others. Market boards will always list available items based on how much they are being sold for. If you are selling the cheapest item, your listing will be at the top of the board. This is true despite stacking said items causing the overall total to go up. You could have a stack of 99 items above a stack of 2, simply because the person with the larger stack is selling their items cheaper per unit than the other individual. This leads to a culture of undercutting, as most players want to be at the top of the board for faster sales. However, this can lead to prices plummeting and price wars between individuals. Some players are incredibly patient and will leave their items on the board at their desired price and wait for the pricing trends to hopefully correct themselves. Others may package their items in multiple smaller stacks for players that want multiple of an item but don't want to spend on a stack of 99. One of the biggest aspects of any MMO is character creation. variation. On top of the available races I already went over within the settings section of this video, players also have to choose their own starting class. But they aren't limited by this selection. See, in Final Fantasy XIV, the thing that dictates your class is what weapon you're holding. Equip an axe, you're suddenly a marauder. Equip a staff, you may become a conjurer. You know? You choose your initial class at the start of the game and can soon after unlock the ability to use other classes by visiting their respective guilds, which are spread out throughout the 3 major city-states mentioned previously. If you choose to be a conjurer, you'd end up in Gridania, but choose to be a marauder and you'll find yourself starting in Limsa Lominsa. Classes follow the design ideology of the Holy Trinity. You have healers, tanks, and DPS, and these generally work in unison to complete content. The tanks will hold the enemy's attention, taking the brunt of the damage, while the DPS deals damage and the healer keeps everyone alive. While this is the general game plan, there's different classes with different utility, and good healers can set up enough healing over time or shielding to deal their own minimal DPS when possible and make instances go by faster. This has always been a point of contention within the community. There's many healers that feel like they are solely expected to heal, and many other classes that expect them to deal DPS whenever possible. Is there a sole right way to play the game? In a broad sense, yes, but dictating whether or not a player is going to play as optimally as possible in a casual MMO experience has always been a little silly to me. That being said, in endgame high rank content, you're going to want to see as much damage being dealt as possible, meaning healers probably aren't going to be solely healing. As players progress in level, they'll eventually reach a point in class progression where they get to ascend said class into a job. Jobs function the same as a class, but generally get added features such as new actions for the hotbar or the inclusion of a job gauge, although that latter option wasn't added until Stormblood's expansion. Once unlocked, if the player was equipped with the proper weapon and the proper soul crystal, their class would change into their new job. Now, while these classes will fall into one of 3 possible options within the Holy Trinity, it's not the only thing that defines them. For DPS specifically, you have melee, physical ranged, and magic ranged as subtypes. Every class would have 3 gauges to keep track of, those being HP, MP, and TP. HP is your health points, which depletes as you take damage, and mana was only really utilized by magic casting classes and maybe by certain abilities from other classes as well, but only really magic had to worry about it excessively. TP, on the other hand, was used for a few things, mostly weapon skills that were activated by non-magic DPS classes or tanks. It works a bit differently to MP and was strictly designed to regenerate over time. Oddly enough, the sprint function, which can be used by any class, didn't simply have a cooldown to be used, but also completely depleted your TP no matter its value. It was an annoying decision, as sprinting in this game is a great way of dodging certain telegraphs and AoEs in instances, but the TP system would be reworked multiple times and then completely removed later into the game's lifespan, which was super great for tanks, because if you accidentally sprinted as a tank, you were essentially screwed. DPS or damage per second classes are easily the most popular in the game and add a lot of bloat when it comes to trying to get matched for instances. Generally, the waiting time for DPS classes will always be longer than if you were running a tank or a healer. For DPS, there is the Lancer, which would later become the Dragoon. Lancer focused on using a lance, obviously, as a weapon, and would also make use of the jumping function seen in previous entries of Final Fantasy, most prominently on Kain from Final Fantasy IV. In fact, the Dragoon job armor is completely based off of Kain's look within that entry. Pugilist, on the other hand, was a fist-fighting melee class and could utilize stances to build up high damage while attacking as fast as possible. After leveling it up, players gain the option to unlock the Monk job. Now, something to note about these classes that has persisted over the years, even though I personally think it's a rather dated mechanic, is that they have something called positionals. Melee DPS have specific skills that might do additional effects or more damage based on where the player is positioned relative to the enemy that they are fighting. For example, one ability might expect you to be behind the enemy, and one may expect you to be on either side. This is possible thanks to the inclusion of tanks, who will generally keep an enemy locked in a specific position and facing a specific way. For ranged classes, you have Archer, which would eventually upgrade into the Bard class and utilize songs to buff themselves and the party while attacking from the safety of distance. Then you had Thaumaturge, which would become Black Mage, focusing on magic casting and mana management to deal high damage with minimal movement. Arcanist is a little special because it's a magic casting DPS class with some healing functionality. It's the hunter or pet class where you can command their pet to perform various actions while dealing their own damage. But what's really interesting about this specific class is that it has two job options. Arcanist can either become a summoner and move on to unlock various miniature forms of primals to use in battle, or they can become a scholar, which is a dedicated healing class. For healing classes, you obviously had a scholar branch from Arcanist, and this acted as a shield healer specifically, while the next healing class would use regenerative abilities to heal over time. It was the job of the scholar to prevent damage entirely by casting abilities that would place shields on players. Conjurer was said other healing class and would transition into the iconic white mage job once the player had progressed far enough. This was actually my main class at the start of a Realm Reborn, and I wouldn't switch out of it until Stormblood, where I picked up Astrologian, a job released in Heaven's Ward. Its main game is big heals and healing over time. It was the most mana heavy healing class, but had a huge pool of mana to pull from to make up for this. For tanks, you had Gladiator and Marauder. Gladiator was a pure sword and shield tank. Its main objective was being as defensive as possible. In fact, to this day, it's the only real class that utilizes the offhand equipment slot for the shield, with the exception of Conjurers early on having the option of using one-handed wands. It transitions into the Paladin class through progression. Marauder was my secondary class and would become the warrior job later on. Rather than focusing slowly on being a tank, warriors were very effective at outputting DPS as well. Instead of mitigating damage, they focused on having as much HP as possible and dealing as much damage when they could. Now, before the release of Stormblood, a big motivating factor for using different classes was the cross-class system. This is no longer the case, but it used to be that players had a special selection of skills that they could unlock by leveling up different classes. For example, at level 26, Thaumaturge would unlock the Swiftcast ability, which allows the user to activate one spell instantly without a cast bar. This is highly valuable for something like a healer considering how long it takes to revive, but you couldn't get it without playing Thaumaturge for at least 26 levels, and grinding wasn't the smallest task. And that's just one example. Many classes had multiple abilities that could be shared, some not even unlocking until level 42 in a game where the max level was 50. Not every shareable skill was necessary to be utilized by other classes, but some were incredibly effective and almost always expected to have been unlocked when running things like endgame content and raids. This stopped being a factor in Stormblood, but would be a major aspect of the game for a good amount of years. Classes aren't just defined by their actions and abilities, but also by their attributes and stats, and at one point, technically, their elemental and physical resistances. A lot of these stats got streamlined along the way, but in 2.0, players would have the ability to add a bonus attribute point to an attribute of their choice every few levels. However, due to game balance, these points would usually just get dumped into a single attribute, and this would be removed later as a part of a redesign and streamlining effort seen in Stormblood. Lots of rebalancing in Stormblood. The main attributes that govern a character's battle prowess are strength, dexterity, vitality, intelligence, mind, and piety. Nowadays, every class will have a primary attribute that helps define what would make them the most effective in battle. But in 2.0 and onward, for a while, this wasn't as simple as it sounds. Take healing classes, which will rely on mind to raise the potency of their healing abilities. These classes also had to consider allocating points to intelligence in order to raise their attack potency, considering that they were spellcasters, and potentially raising piety to increase maximum MP. However, this would also get streamlined as well later on, so that mind affected both healing and damage dealing potency, and piety would be demoted from main attribute to a role specific stat that only affects healers. Strength was used to increase melee attack power as well as parry and block rates. Dexterity would increase ranged attack rates as well as ninja and rogue, which are introduced in later patches. This stat would also increase parry and block rates. Vitality was strictly for increasing maximum HP, while piety was for MP. Finally, intelligence was for increasing magic attack damage, and mind was for increasing healing potency as mentioned earlier. There are multiple substats as well. I won't go into every single one, but a few examples include critical hit rate, which would naturally boost the chance of landing critical damage as well as raising the amount of said damage. Skill and spell speed, which allows the player to lower the overall global cooldown values of their abilities, and if you don't know what that is, essentially, each time you use an ability, there's a set amount of seconds before you can use another. Raising these stats can help lower that time, therefore potentially raising DPS or healing. Accuracy though is potentially the most interesting stat due to its removal later in the game. However, this is the stat that determines whether or not an attack is going to hit or miss. While this concept is removed later on, it's still technically a factor in the game when fighting things that are a higher level than you. Now, Disciples of War or battle classes aren't the only aspect of the game. In fact, there's a large number of crafters and gatherers to choose from, and players can max the level on all of them and were incentivized to back then through the cross-class system. Similar to battle classes, crafters really benefited from leveling up all 8 of the potential options because many abilities that were highly useful to crafters were locked behind specific classes. Crafting is kind of a puzzle in this game due to how the quality of items works. Generally speaking, items are either going to be normal quality or high quality, with high quality items either being beneficial through their boosted stats or when talking about equipment or potions, or their ability to help make other high quality items easier when talking about ingredients. See, anybody can open up their crafting menu, choose a recipe, and make something. It's incredibly easy to raise the progress of an item through crafter abilities until it's completed. The nuance comes in through the item's durability while crafting as well as its quality level. You have a 0 to 100% chance of making an item high quality, and you raise that percentage by filling a quality gauge during the crafting process. The issue is that each action you use will lower the durability of the item you are working on, and if you completely deplete it, the synthesis will fail. This is where all of the extra abilities come in. There are plenty of crafting abilities that can raise the durability of the synthesis or raise the amount of quality you gain with each action, etc. And many of these abilities can only be used once you level a specific crafting class. And considering how generalized crafters are, with each of them having unique recipes but all wearing the same gear and generally having similar synthesis and quality abilities, if you level up all crafters, they'll all benefit from each other the same way. I won't get too much into the process specifically, but the same can be said for gatherers as well, which can also share gathering gear between their classes. However, the main hand and offhand tools for all crafters and gatherers are unique to their class and are the main defining factors when switching between them. Additionally, these abilities don't cost MP or TP, but CP for crafters and GP for gatherers. When in the middle of a crafting attempt, the pool of your CP won't actually regenerate, so even if you are fairly talented in knowing which abilities to use when, if you don't raise the right stats, you might not have enough points to even use them consistently. CP regenerates fully after every craft, while GP regenerates slowly over time when not in specific gathering events. Every class requires equipment, and there's plenty of that to go around. On top of having your main weapon that defines your class, players have the ability of wearing several pieces of gear from hats to boots and many accessories as well. All of these contribute to your character's overall stats, and while some pieces can be worn by multiple classes, some others will be class specific or designed for a specific class despite being considered a generic piece of equipment. Early on in the game, there were little nuances as well, such as conjurers being able to use one-handed wands instead of two-handed staffs. You generally see on white mages, meaning they could equip a shield for extra defensive stats. There were even armor pieces that filled multiple slots, like these big cloaks, and they'd have higher overall stats to make up for this, but generally kind of sucked. Not only do some of these items have level requirements, but they also have their own independent level starting at level 50. Consider that a player can progress past the level of 50 at the end of a Realm Reborn due to that being the max level possible. That didn't mean that there weren't going to be new story progression patches or content released. Rather than raising the level each patch, players could instead get level 50 equipment that had higher item levels. Is an easy way for a player to quickly compare if their gear was outdated in comparison to something they received or the content that they were about to run. In fact, dungeons and other events after the main scenario may expect you to have at least a specific item level average in order to take part, and other dungeons may sink your stats down depending on what your average item level is and stats currently are. In terms of rarity, equipment generally comes in these flavors: white or common, which are generally the weakest pieces you'll be finding; pink or ethereal, generally found in dungeons and marginally better than common; green or unique equipment, which can range from being decent to some of the best in the game depending on what you're obtaining; blue or artifact equipment, which is generally reserved for special token based or raid reward gear; and finally purple or relic equipment, which we'll get into a bit later in some of the patches for Realm Reborn. And that's not all equipment has to offer. On top of the obvious stat gains that come with equipment, crafted pieces can generally be made high quality as mentioned previously, which will lead lead to them having higher stats than their normal quality counterparts. On top of this, many pieces of equipment will have multiple slots available for melding materia into them, a feature taken from Final Fantasy VII, but rather than containing abilities and the like, they're purely for raising stats. In 2.0, players could unlock the ability to meld materia as long as they had a crafter at level 19 or higher in order to accept the quest. If players didn't want to go through the process of leveling crafters or melding their own materia, they could seek the aid of other players or even use NPC materia melders for a small fee. However, the NPCs had their downsides, specifically not having the ability to overmeld, which we'll get into shortly. Now, certain pieces of equipment could generally have any type of materia melded to them, but the type of materia you were going to meld would generally be something that would benefit your class the most. Not only that, but the game has its own restrictions on what can actively be added. If it will only let you raise the critical hit rate 10 points and you try to meld a materia that has a higher amount than this, you'll lose the extra points as you have already reached the stat capacity. Melding generally isn't a big factor in casual play, and I don't think many people would bother melding at all except for endgame crafters or raiders looking to maximize DPS or other stats in order to complete difficult content. But you can really maximize certain stats through the mechanic known as advanced melding, which could only be unlocked through a special quest that was available at level 19 but could only be turned in at level 25. Completing this specific materia side quest would unlock advanced materia melding, allowing players to overmeld their sets. Let's say that a piece of equipment had 2 materia slots. Melding to each of those slots would have a guaranteed success rate of 100%. But despite there being 2 slots, players could actually meld onto that item up to 3 more times, which was called overmelding, and if you did all 5 of them, called pentamelding. And this would allow endgame players to really pump their stats and push further within endgame content. Now, the big downside is that not only could materia be fairly expensive back then, but overmelding also has a chance of failure based on how many times you successfully overmelded already and the stats of the materia you are attempting to meld in. And you'll generally be seeing stuff like 17% down to 5%, meaning you could be spending a lot of gil in order to make some of the best pieces stat-wise in the game. It should be pointed out that a lot of equipment that have materia slots are forbidden from using the advanced melding mechanic, meaning they cannot be overmelded. This is usually seen on endgame tombstone gear, as they'll generally have higher stats that can be accentuated with a few materia slots. There's plenty of ways to obtain materia within the game, but one prominent way for players using a lot of gear and progressing through the game would be to transmutate their spirit bonded gear into a random materia. Spirit bonding is the act of using equipped gear until a specific spirit gauge is full. They then get the option of destroying said piece of gear in order to convert it into a random materia piece. This is good for players progressing who want to make use of old gear, but with how easy it can be to obtain materia later on in the game's lifespan, I don't actually know how well it holds up nowadays. One final major point about equipment is that it has durability. This runs out over natural use, and more so when players deplete their HP, knocking them out. Durability doesn't matter too much until it's fully depleted, as equipment will become essentially useless. This can be incredibly dangerous if the player is in the middle of some sort of instance content with other players, as leaving mid-event is not only frowned upon, but punishable. Repairing equipment can be done by talking to various NPC menders around Eorzea, or you can repair it yourself with the proper crafting class per item and a combination of dark matter, which is used specifically for this scenario. Generally, you're probably better off just repairing it at an NPC. When it comes to endgame gear, players generally have 2 options, either crafting or purchasing crafted gear at the current highest item level for said gear, or saving up a special currency known as Allagan tomestones. As I recall, Allagan tomestones weren't introduced right away, but as players reached endgame, there was a large amount of players looking to get into raiding or other endgame content, but finding it extremely difficult to do so due to the main endgame equipment being fairly low stat-wise in comparison to what they were running. Tomestones were introduced in 2.0, however, just not within a major or minor patch, and the first inclusion for them were Allagan tomestones of philosophy and mythology. Players could earn these through running virtually anything that was considered a level 50 instance, so dungeon trials, etc. were the main way of farming these, and roulettes once introduced would also offer bonuses to these currencies, but again, we'll get into that later. Philosophy would allow players to obtain eye level 70 Dark Light gear, and it could be earned up to a max of 2,000 total. Meanwhile, mythology would only allow players to earn up to 450 weekly quickly and would be earned at a much slower rate. This currency allowed players to obtain eye level 90 heroes armor, and this would go on to be the trend throughout the patches and lifespan of each expansion. Players would reach endgame and max level, start earning tomestones, use said tomestones for better gear, and use said better gear to progress in endgame content. Then, when major patches come out, new tomestones may be introduced for even better gear. This still happens as of today in Shadowbringers. So we talked about equipment, classes, and generally how a character is going to progress via levels and stats in the game. So the next natural step seems to be talking about story progression and questing, essentially what the player is going to do in order to level up and move from point A to B. This could be anything from completing quests to dungeons to trials, or grinding via special events known as fates, or spending leaves to run leave quests throughout the various areas. I think the best place to start is the battle system. Generally speaking, through the majority of the content in the game, you're going to be exploring the world and environments while completing small quests and side quests. You can do almost all of this stuff solo while running instance content such as dungeons with groups either pre-made or matched. The battle system itself is fairly simple. You either play solo or with a party of up to 8 people. If matched, your party will generally consist of 1 tank, 1 healer, and 2 DPS in a 4-man, and 2 tanks, 2 healers, and 4 DPS in an 8-man. As mentioned previously, players work on a system known as a global cooldown timer. If I use one ability, all other abilities tied to the global cooldown will be on cooldown for a set period. These aren't the only abilities in your arsenal, however. Generally speaking, players will have abilities that can be activated at any time with significantly longer cooldowns. These are known as OGCDs, or off global cooldowns, and act as a means of providing abilities that can be weaved in between your main abilities while you wait for them to refresh. These could range from buffs to really big healing options, or some sort of high damage ability that you can only use every so often. While in a group of 4 or more, the players will build up a limit gauge, which is a party-specific ability that can be charged in 3 tiers. Parties of 4 will see 1 gauge while running content, but it will change to 2 gauges and begin charging during major boss fights. You basically see 1 gauge and fill it while traversing a dungeon, and then have the ability to charge the second level of the gauge when fighting the boss. Parties of 8 have 2 gauges and a third during major boss fights. In a Realm Reborn, activating the limit break is different depending on the class archetype and the level of the limit break when used. For example, healers could perform a strong AoE heal at level 1, but level 3 was a party-wide revive and full heal. Great for picking up the pieces of a fight gone wrong. Meanwhile, tanks could perform a party-wide damage mitigation buff that was stronger based on the level of the limit break used, and DPS on the other hand had multiple other options. Melee DPS had the ability to perform high damage single target attacks, while caster DPS could create a large circular AoE instead. Oddly enough, the physical range DPS, i.e. solely barred by this point in the game, would simply perform the healing LB instead of their own unique version, though this would be changed later on. Final Fantasy XIV was also one of the main games to start utilizing a telegraph system heavily, with many floor markers and other effects allowing players to know where they needed to stand in order to be out of danger for AoEs and other effects. In order to access a lot of this instance content, players would have to take part in one of the main forms of content in the game, questing. Final Fantasy had a clear storyline and progression system for players to follow, something they worked on as a means of remedying the failure that was 1.0. They wanted to have a clear set of quests that would lead the player from start to finish within the storyline, while allowing them to explore other content whenever they wanted to. These sets of quests are known as MSQs, or main scenario quests, and would generally act as a main requirement for making it to the end game of the current release, as well as a requirement for other forms of content. Usually quests would have a level prerequisite to ensure that the player was taking time to gain experience outside of the storyline, and there were also many ways to do that. Your first thought may be side quests, and while these are a valid means of earning experience, generally their effectiveness begins to fall off in the later levels. Not only that, but on top of being fairly bland content-wise, if you wanted to level up another class, you may find yourself running out of quests within given areas you've traversed previously. Some side quests have more value than experience, however, since many can unlock features within the game, such as optional dungeons, trials, or even the 24-man raids that would be introduced in a later patch. Some of this side content could even later become a requirement to have completed in order to progress through the main scenario quest. Early in the game's life, the main way to gain experience was to either run dungeons or participate in special world events called fates. See, the downside of dungeon running was that certain classes were oversaturated in comparison to others. A tank would have an incredibly easy time getting matched into a dungeon due to how few existed in comparison to DPS, which is a natural occurrence considering how many DPS classes there are in comparison to other archetypes. So a great way to earn EXP was to take part in fates or full active time events. These were events that would appear randomly or scheduled based on which they were within random areas of the explorable world. While they didn't require a party, you generally benefited from having one due to how contributing to said event would work. Generally, some sort of objective would appear, players would go kill a monster, many monsters, or, collect something, and how much you contributed would determine your level or reward from bronze to silver to gold. And gold would naturally have the highest EXP reward, with some of the highest EXP possible early on in the game's lifespan in the close to endgame areas like Camp Blue Fog. It wouldn't be rare to see many people in this zone early on, all taking part in the fates as they spawned in order to try and reach level 50 as fast as possible. In fact, white mages were incredibly useful in these areas as they had one of the strongest AoEs in the game with Holy. Parties were naturally beneficial here as everyone's contributions would help contribute to your own rank and you'd share experience with the mobs your party members would kill, but again, it wasn't completely necessary. Players could attack targets with damage over time effects on many enemies or use AoEs when possible to contribute during fates, where they fight a lot of mobs and other events were easy to receive a high rank in. This type of system isn't incredibly unique today, but it was a fairly new concept on release of Final Fantasy XIV and continues to be an important aspect of the game to this day, usually tying into requiring them for different endgame content items or quests. Just to make note of it, but there was one specific fight in the Black Shroud that would appear in a random area and change the weather once available. If players took part in it, they'd find themselves fighting against Odin and could get special rewards to unlock various Odin-specific items. Odin will also take the appearance of the last person who landed a killing blow against him. The main scenario isn't the only thing locked behind a level requirement. There's also class and job-specific quests that require the player to be at least a specific level to take part in, usually unlocking in increments of 5 levels for class quests until level 30, where players could begin to unlock their class's job or jobs if you're an Arcanist. I haven't mentioned this yet, but classes actually expected you to not only complete your class quests up to level 30, but also have a specific secondary class leveled up to 15 in order to advance. Once advanced, players would continue to unlock new quests in 5-level increments up to level 50, although level 45 to 50 each had 2 quests available instead of the normal 1. Finally, scattered throughout the various areas and towns are individuals who will allow players to take part in Lev quests. These are special quests that function just like your typical side quests, but are repeatable and require something known as an allowance to take part in. Players can have a max of 100 allowances and use 1 per quest that they accept, with the allowances regenerating over time. Levs come in 3 flavors, those being Battlecraft for normal classes, Fieldcraft for gatherers, and Tradecraft for crafters. I've never known how effective they are for battle classes, but they become almost broken in usefulness when it comes to leveling up crafters and gatherers. This is due to crafting and gathering levels only requiring you to turn in items, many of which you could buy from the market board if you have the Gil, and if you choose to turn in high quality items, you gain double the EXP reward. To put this into perspective, I managed to get fishing, a class I never leveled before until Shadowbringers, from level 1 to 80 in 1 day. Now, outside of questing to progress and gain EXP, players also take part in special instance events known as duties, which came in all shapes and sizes. Sometimes a quest may ask the player to take part in a solo instance story event where they'll fight along NPCs to succeed. Other times they will unlock instances known as dungeons and trials and be required to complete those to move on. Many core dungeons and trials would be unlocked via the main scenario quest, but it was very easy to miss many dungeons and even trials later on due to them being unlocked via side quests. Nowadays, side quests that unlock a unique mechanic or event have a special plus icon on the main side quest icon. Like it's the side quest icon and then it's a plus icon. But this wasn't the case before, and you'd have to rely on documentation, forums, or other forms of word of mouth to know where to find everything. Dungeons are by far the biggest aspect of party-based content in Final Fantasy XIV. As the player progresses, there will be many dungeons for them to explore and take part in, but the design of said dungeons mechanically changes drastically as the series progresses. Early on, dungeons were much more open and mechanic heavy, favoring exploration and trying to give off a very unique feel. Some dungeons might expect you to explore their winding paths in order to find specific keys or energy sources to unlock gates along the way, and the amount of bosses or higher tier encounters within these dungeons could vary drastically. It really felt like the designers were throwing throwing anything that came to their mind at the wall to see if it would stick. But for a game that relies heavily on you potentially rerunning content numerous times, a lot of these early dungeons can feel exhausting, and the explorability of said dungeons is less enticing. As new dungeons are made later on, the designers really began to streamline the process, having most dungeons focus on the same general flow or game loop, with players running through a set of mobs until they reach a boss and repeating this 2 more times, meaning that most dungeons consist of 3 major encounters with fillers in between. The main uniqueness of dungeons comes from their landscapes and architecture, as well as how the boss functions, and less so on getting from one boss to another. One huge pitfall of this early design is the final dungeons of the game being incredibly cutscene heavy, forcing players that wanted to watch them for storyline purposes to be left behind by repeating players who have either already watched them or skipped them entirely. It wasn't rare to have people rush to the first boss of Castrum Meridianum, I think, and you're left by yourself as the cutscene ends. This was later given a band-aid patch fix in 4.2, making it so no one can skip cutscenes in these specific dungeons, but they're so inherently long, this ended up punishing players looking to run main scenario roulette, which we'll get into later, but needless to say that many dungeons after this point weren't as egregious with their cutscenes or design complexity and scope. 2.0 specifically shipped with 16 dungeons, ranging from secret pirate caves to haunted mansions to Garlean strongholds and more. I'm not going to go into active detail about each one, but I'll list them all here. And I should also mention that most dungeons are 4-man endeavors, with a rare few being 8-man. Now, trials were the idea of taking boss fights similar to something you would run within a dungeon and making that the sole objective. Players would unlock and queue up for trials, enter into the fight, and be matched against a large, powerful enemy that would be more mechanically intensive than what you would generally see in a dungeon, usually with a higher health pool. The main trials players would take part in included fighting the 3 main primals of a Realm Reborn. Players would go up against Ifrit, followed by Titan, and then Garuda later on. One of the easiest trials is actually at level 49, called Cape Westwind. Players have to fight a Garlean general named Ritatin Sas Arvina, but it's one of the easiest fights in the game, especially nowadays, and lasts less than 5 minutes, making it a treat to grab via roulette for easy EXP bonuses. In hard trials, which are more difficult versions of Ifrit, Titan, and Garuda, these are semi-optional side quests but become a requirement later on. The hard trial bosses would hit harder and generally have more advanced versions of previous mechanics. Additionally, these turned the trials from 4-man experiences into 8-man experiences, with most trials generally being 8-man experiences from then on. A lot of players enjoy completing the hardest content within a game for various rewards. In Final Fantasy XIV and many other MMOs, this would be through something called raids, in which players traverse areas teeming with incredibly strong enemies and strong bosses with increasingly intensive mechanics, requiring a lot more precision than what is typically seen. Players can not only receive rewards such as mounts within certain points of these raids, but materials for high-end gear and sometimes high-end gear within the raid itself. 2.0 specifically introduced the Binding Coil of Bahamut, which played off the plot points of 1.0 near the end of its life. The raid consisted of 5 turns, which you could think of as 5 separate dungeons or trials. Generally, the further you got, the better the materials and equipment you'd receive, readying you to run the next level of content when it released in further patches. One final example of duties were guild hests that were unlocked as you progressed in level up to level 40, but were mostly just tutorial encounters that players could run to gain a better understanding of the game and its mechanics. 2 trials were also added, but are a bit special in their design and how they were activated, as they weren't actively part of the duty finder at their time of release. They're also tied into a mechanic known as the relic weapons. Relic weapons are endgame gear that function as a type of alternative to raiding weapons that are unlocked by completing high-end raid content. The main difference between them is that instead of requiring a high skill check to obtain, they instead rewarded players through excessive grinding, and I really do mean excessive, as these weapons were absolutely atrocious to obtain within the start of their lifespan. Early on, the relic and zodiac weapons even had aspects of their stats that were customizable. What really makes these weapons interesting and appealing is their visual appearance. Fully upgraded relic weapons have a large amount of particle effects surrounding them that many weapons do not, and were often sought after for this reason alone, as this was fairly rare to see in the series at the time. In A Realm Reborn, players had to complete the A Relic Reborn questline in in order to unlock their respective weapons. This required them to find their weapons in a specific location that was dependent on their job. Players then had to purchase or craft a specific weapon for their class and infuse 2 specific grade 3 materia to it before going on to take part in the first relic trial, where they had to defeat a Dorm Chimera as their chosen class. But they didn't do this through the duty finder, instead needing to go to a specific location in Coerthas where they could take part in a fight with a party of 8. Players then had to complete the dungeon Amdapor Keep as their chosen class, and I just want to take a minute to say that this dungeon was a literal and figurative wall for so many people due to the second boss, Demon Wall. A recurring enemy in the series, Demon Wall's boss fight sets players on a narrow pathway that they can fall off while advancing on the party. If players don't defeat it in time, they'll lose instantly and need to take care of dodging AoEs and killing high damage mobs, all while watching their footing. It was easily one of the most technical fights at the time for so early on, and really threw a lot of people when they attempted it. The biggest issue was that the wall could repel people backwards based on which way they were facing, so players could easily get launched off the edge and die instantly. Players would then defeat a specific amount of beastmen depending on their class before needing to fight the other relic specific trial, the Hydra, and not only had to be the proper class but have their weapon equipped at the same time. We're not done yet though. Players then had to defeat Ifrit Hard, followed by Garuda and Titan Hard respectively, and finally turn in a special oil to the blacksmith, creating this weapon to finally complete it. I say complete in air quotes, however, as the weapon would have another level it could ascend to known as Zenith, which was even more powerful at eye level 90 by turning in some specific tombstone currency items. The weapon wouldn't be upgradable again until patch 2.28, and it would be one of the worst grinds in the series history. The 2.0 release of Final Fantasy XIV contained a lot of content and mechanics, some things that would be built upon further and streamlined better as the game went on, but also many mechanics or traits that would be completely reworked or removed. While I didn't go into detail over every mechanic within 2.0, this will hopefully give you an idea of the scope of the game and what it had to offer back then. Moving forward now, we'll look at the 5 individual major patches that led up to Heavensward, as well as the minor patches within them to see what was added. Patch 2.1 was released December 17th, 2013, and would include minor patches 2.15 and 2.16, respectively, under the moniker A Realm Awoken. Every major release in the series starting at 2.0 has 5 major patches with multiple minor patches before leading into the next expansion. Each of these generally continues the main storyline of Final Fantasy XIV with new MSQs, while also adding in multiple new forms of content, from dungeons to trials to side quests, as well as other things for players looking to grind as much as possible. And believe me, there will be grinding discussed. Lots of grinding. On the topic of quests, one of the biggest side quest storylines was introduced as early as A Realm Reborn's first patch under the Hildebrand Manderville moniker. It's essentially a storyline about a player character interacting with an extraordinary gentleman detective and some of the absurd characters and situations that surround him. They're optional for the most part, but can actually unlock some trials later on, making them more than worthwhile in my opinion. It's also just an incredibly charming storyline that goes all the way into and through Stormblood, so it's definitely worth following if you have the time to participate in it. It's even what introduces the recurring Gilgamesh character to this entry in the Final Fantasy series. Something many players look forward to when playing an MMO is the role-playing and customization aspects it has to offer. What better way to experience both of these than having your own house to customize, decorate, and have other players visit? Well, 2.1 began the introduction of the housing system by releasing residential zones within each of the main city-states. These zones would be made up of multiple wards, I believe 5 per area, and were exclusive to free companies at the time of their release. While personal housing wouldn't be added until a few patches later, I think it's still important to talk about the culture that housing cultivated and how poorly I believe it's been implemented even leading up to today. Let's first discuss the options players had at the time of release. As I mentioned, residential zones were limited at first to free companies specifically. Each of the 3 major city-states had their own zones, those being the Lavender Beds in Gridania, the Goblet in Ul'dah, and the Mist in Limsa. Each ward consisted of about 30 plots, and those plots plots came in various sizes and prices depending on where they were located. Some would be small plots for small houses, some medium, and some large, with the price raising depending on location and size. A lot of these prices would be made fairly high at first and would slowly devalue over time. Prices could start at 8 million gil, as an example, lower to 7.5 10 days later, 7.3 15 days later, and all the way to 3.6 90 days later. This was a rate of about 0.14% every 6 hours. This was a system to incentivize larger, more financially successful FCs to get the plots of their choosing and allowing the rest to fill up for the less wealthy groups as time went on. It's basically a scheme to keep you playing as long as possible. Final Fantasy XIV has a lot of players with a lot of gil, many of which could afford a house if there were those available, and while players eventually do get the ability to purchase their own private plots and even more plots and areas are added in the future, there's always just never enough, raising the artificial price of housing outside of its typical built-in price range. And we'll kind of talk about some of the band-aid remedies later, but essentially there just never was enough housing for demand, leading to many players selling their plots to other individuals for more gil than they were technically worth in-game, or maybe even selling them for real-life money. A big reason for this is due to how houses function within the game. Residential areas are their own instance that players enter, similar to entering Gridania or any other unique area in the game. It's not a strictly private instance that can be loaded or deloaded when there's no one inside, so you're left with these expansive areas full of customizable plots and people visiting them, and these areas need to be fully loaded at all times, leading to severe strain within the game. This makes it most likely both financially and physically difficult to create the type of server space necessary to house a system large enough to have enough plots for the amount of players within a server. Some, if not all, servers house up to 100,000 players, with around 10+% of those players being active at any given time. Compare that now in Shadowbringers, where we have about 24 wards per area and 60 plots within them. That adds up to about 5,760 total available houses, thanks to the inclusion of Shirogane and Stormblood, many of which are not even affordable to the average player, meaning said players will most likely be focusing on small plots, cutting down this number further. That's about 5% housing available for the population of a given server, making them both incredibly rare and valuable. Needless to say, housing is a bit of a problem within the game, something that they still attempt to remedy without much success. On the topic of housing customization, players had the ability to place items both indoors and outdoors within their plot and could build houses by spending gil on permits, meaning even after the initial purchase of land, you still had to spend a large sum of gil to even have the house available. I won't get too in detail about the full customization of houses, but basically you'll have a set limit of items you can place inside and outside of your house, and many people have managed to get fairly creative with their designs thanks to various glitches in the game that allow stacking items on top of one another or creating floating items in the air. Another new aspect added to the game was the aesthetician, which was a means for players to change various features of their character like hair or makeup without needing to use a Fantasia potion to do so. It costs a small sum of gil, something like 2,000, but was a great alternative for players who wanted to make small changes here and there. Moving on, this patch was also the first to introduce PvP as an aspect of Final Fantasy XIV. An area called the Wolf's Den was made available within Lanaskia. There's not too much to PvP at this point in the series. It basically allowed players to participate in duels as well as 4v4 arena fights, and also introduced PvP specific actions, which were tailored actions designed to be used against other players. I never spent too much time in PvP except when they began introducing specific unique armor sets as rewards via wolf marks, which is the PvP currency of this game. This patch also saw the introduction of the duty roulette system. Players had the ability to be matched for duties before by selecting the specific duties from a list, but the roulette system was a means of rewarding players for taking part in content that may require more people, even if it wasn't necessarily what you wanted to run. Essentially, you'd queue for the roulette and get placed into a random duty that required your class type. On top of the typical rewards you could expect from running one of the duties, you'd also get daily bonus for taking part in the roulette, and an even bigger bonus if your class was marked as being particularly sought after. But healers could also find duties fairly easily. On release, duty roulette consisted of low level, high level, main scenario, and guild tests, but these options would change over time. The original party finder was also released in this patch, allowing players to form groups for specific duties with customized goals, and these would be displayed for anyone looking within said said party finder. You could search for a group running a specific duty and you'd receive a list of parties that were created for it. Treasure maps are another aspect introduced here that would last up to the current releases of 14. Gathering classes had the opportunity of finding maps while gathering from specific nodes. These maps could then be activated to show a specific location on a small map, although zoomed in, and players could then locate said area for a reward. However, the reward was generally guarded by a set of mobs, meaning running these as a party was preferred. However, the rewards for these maps could be fairly substantial, especially later on in the series, and there's good money to be made from them. Most MMOs have dailies, and while you can consider something like the Duty Roulette a form of daily, Final Fantasy XIV added something that was more specifically tailored to this idea under the moniker of Beast Tribes. Players can now complete quest lines in order to unlock two tribes, the Sylph and the Amalja. Doing so would allow the player to complete up to 3 quests for each tribe daily at the cost of an allowance system. Even if you had enough allowances to take part in more than 3, it generally capped at this with one specific exception. See, players would gain small amounts of reputation every time they completed one of these daily quests. Reaching the max amount of reputation for your current reputation level would unlock a special quest that you use to rank up in the specific beast tribe. This had multiple advantages. For one, ranking up after completing 3 quests would allow you to complete a second set of 3 quests that day. On top of this, players would unlock more items upon ranking up that they could buy from the beast tribe shops using their special currencies. Outside of the currency-based rewards, the best part about the beast tribes was how relatively easy they were in comparison to how much experience they would reward you, meaning doing them daily was not only a great way to unlock new items, but also level up your alternative classes. 3 new dungeons were unlocked within this patch, the first of which was Pharaoh Sirius, a lighthouse that was affected by the Calamity in 1.0 and is now controlled by a siren that the party has to take care of. More interestingly is the inclusion of the 2 side quest dungeons, Copperbell Mines Hard and Hawk Manor Hard. These were the first hard labeled dungeons, but hard wasn't just a change in stats at an additional challenge for the players. Instead, these dungeons were a complete reworking of the original, usually with their own storyline built off of their easier counterparts. For example, Hawk Manor has you fighting new mobs, bosses, and exploring new locations within the haunted manor, and the same could be said for Copperbell. These weren't lazy updates to existing dungeons, but rather a new experience for the players within a familiar setting. Trials also introduced new extended and more difficult versions of previous encounters. Ifrit, Garuda, and Titan all were given extreme title fights. These fights were exceptionally more difficult and mechanic heavy than the previous, containing aspects of the older versions while introducing new mechanics entirely. These would usually reward players with rare mounts or high eye level equipment as an alternative to tombstone grinding or raid grinding, but players still would have to roll for these items using a traditional need/greed system seen in many MMOs. Ultimate Weapon, a boss fight that is technically held within the confines of a dungeon instance, also received its own trial that was more difficult than the original. However, it wasn't labeled extreme, showing that this moniker was slightly inconsistent at the start. Finally, a new trial was added called Thorn March, where players would fight Great King Moogle Mog XII, as well as his group of Moogles, each of whom represented a class within the game. Players had to focus on and defeat these Moogles in specific order in order to prevent them from getting off various different effects that could easily wipe the party, then deal with the king himself. This was also the introduction of a new type of raid known as 24-mans, in which 3 groups of 8-player parties would band together in order to take on relatively large dungeons in comparison to what the player would normally run. These 24-man excursions are always broken up into 3s per expansion, with them releasing a new entry within the major patches, usually up to the end of the expansion lifetime. These are used to not only contain their own Grand Wall storylines, some of which weave directly back into the MSQ, but also offer players a weekly grinding endeavor that they can use to get high-level gear. I say weekly because generally players will only be able to receive 1 reward per week through rolling for equipment, and usually some sort of weekly token reward that is necessary for upgrading endgame tombstone or raiding gear. This series in A Realm Reborn focused on the Crystal Tower, a dungeon in Final Fantasy III. The fights within would feature many bosses and aesthetics from this entry in the series. The first of these 3 new raids was introduced in 2.1 under the moniker Labyrinth of the Ancients, which is based specifically on the Ancients Maze dungeon seen in Final Fantasy III. Players travel through the dungeon in a central area where they must traverse the left path, followed by returning to the center and going right, and then finally straight ahead. A lot of the content is designed to split the 24-man alliance into their parties of 8, usually requiring them to stand in specific areas to activate effects that benefit the entire alliance. Some final notes on 2.1 are the inclusion of the vote dismiss function, which would allow players to kick other members of the party out when taking part in duties. These were for specific reasons such as the player going offline, becoming AFK, etc., and players that abused the system could be punished. It also wasn't activatable until 15 minutes into the instance, and players couldn't be in the middle of a battle when activating it. One of the more prominent quality of life improvements was the character screen showing the average item level on players based on the eye level of their individual equipment pieces. This made it much easier for players to gauge where they were effectiveness-wise in comparison to the content that they wanted to run. Patch 2.2 released March 27, 2014. Titled Through the Maelstrom, the main theme and marketing factor was the inclusion of Leviathan as a new primal fight. On top of adding a set of new storyline quests, the continuation of the Hildebrand detective questline was also included. New dungeons included the lost city of Amdapor, an abandoned city that had been retaken by elementals, as well as creatures known as Voidsent. It was a particularly interesting dungeon due to the final boss of it being Diabolos, a recurring character in the Final Fantasy series. Diabolos wouldn't just show up in this dungeon, however, but also within the 24-man series finale within Heavensward. Other dungeons included 2 new hard mode inclusions for Halatali and Brayflox's Longstop. As mentioned, the main trial to be added at this point was Leviathan. An interesting thing to note about this trial and some of the other trials that will be released later is that there is no Leviathan easy or normal mode. Instead, the fight is broken up into strictly the required hard mode for the MSQ and the optional extreme mode that released alongside it within this patch. This was definitely one of the more interesting fights, especially in extreme, as the railings of the raft that the fight took place on could come off and players that fell off would die instantly. It also had a mechanic that required players to use a shield to block an instant kill attack, which led to a lot of confusion and misunderstandings later on. Funnily enough, I believe this was one of the fights where if you did too much DPS, you would actually trigger the insta-kill mechanic before the ability to use the shield was available, though this was later remedied. Thornmarch also received an extreme trial in this patch, and there were a few unique trials added for players as well. The first of these would be Battle on the Big Bridge, and was tied directly into the Hildebrand questline. Players would be up against Gilgamesh in his quest to acquire strong weapons. The Dorm Chimera and the Hydra from the Relic questline also had their specific trials added to the Duty Finder in patch 2.16. Patch 2.2 brought with it the next stage of raids for the Coil of Bahamut series, the second Coil of Bahamut. Unlike the first set of raids, which had 5 total turns or duties to take part in, the second coil was only made up of 4. There wouldn't be brand new content for the raiding scene after this for a while, however patch 2.3 would introduce an interesting mechanic to raids that would be reworked slightly to be a consistent feature in later entries. Duty Roulette also received a few new changes, namely in 2 new roulettes being added. One of these was Expert Roulette, which was designed around offering tome bonuses to players who had completed all of the latest high-end dungeons, meaning you'd have to be caught up on both the main scenario quest and any side quest dungeons in order to run these, and they would begin to cycle out older dungeons for new ones as patches introduced more. Trial Roulette was also added and allowed players a means of earning bonuses by taking part in pretty much any trial that the game had to offer. It's a bit of a coin toss, since on one hand you could enter into a very easy fight like Cape Westwind that takes less than 5 minutes, while on the other you could find yourself in a particularly difficult encounter wasting a lot of your time. This set of patches was also the first time we would see tomestones begin to shift and phase out, which was a regular occurrence as patches were released. Tomestones of Philosophy were completely phased out, while Mythology was made unlimited, and Tomestones of Soldiery were introduced. Players that had deprecated tomestones could transfer them into Mythology at a rate of 4-to-1, I believe. 2 new beast tribes were added as well, those being the Sahagin and Kobolds, which players could complete dailies for in order to receive various rewards. In terms of housing, the main inclusion within this set of patches was definitely the gardening mechanic, which allowed players to place gardening patches which could hold between 4 to 8 plants. Players could take care of the crops by planting seeds, using soil, and actively tending to them. An interesting set of inclusions is small houses gaining a basement, something that was not originally intended for them, crafting facilities which increase crafter CP for a limited period of time, and the ability to add a summoning bell into a house so players could use the retainers from within. Speaking of retainers, this patch was when they received the ability to assign a class and participate in ventures. These ventures are broken up depending on the class, but the main categories you'd usually see are hunting, field exploration, and quick exploration, which unlocks at specific retainer levels. Quick exploration is probably one of the more useful for leveling up and obtaining items over time, as you simply send your retainer out for about an hour to come back with something random. Hunting, on the other hand, is a similarly timed excursion, but you can send your retainer out for specific items depending on which class they are, such as fish for fishermen. These have various various limitations like not being able to send a retainer out for a fish that you haven't caught yourself. Finally, field exploration is an incredibly long excursion, I think something like 18 hours for a large amount of EXP and some items. These were better to run if you didn't expect to be around the summoning bell much during your playtime or while away from your computer. Now, a big aspect of many MMOs at the time was not only the gear you wore, but how it looked. Due to players generally wanting to wear the best gear, this could sometimes lead to a fairly mismatched clown suit that wasn't overly appealing aesthetically. This led to the introduction of the glamour system. Glamours are very different now in comparison to how they were in 2.0. The first limitation is that players need to complete a quest at level 50 in order to even have the ability to change the look of their equipment. Then they would unlock the cast glamour action. Players would then take their main piece, the piece to become the glamour, and a specific glamour prism and cast them together to make one piece look like another, without the loss of any equipment. Back at this point in the game, glamour prisms came in specific grades that were necessary for different item levels. Not only that, but depending on what you were wanting to change, you would need a woodworking glamour or a weaver glamour, etc. It was very unnecessarily convoluted. 2.28 introduced Atma, Animus, and Novus Zodiac weapons, which were the next 3 tiers for a player's relic. Getting Atma took a long period of time and grinding due to the need to obtain items called Atmas via any randomly spawning fates in given areas per Atma. I believe the drop rate nowadays is 25%, but this absolutely wasn't the case when they first released. These items were so rare that people often wondered if they were doing something wrong in attempting to complete them, and players needed 12 distinct Atmas in order to progress the relic to Atma Zodiac status. It was by far the biggest hell grind anyone had ever seen by this point in the series, and it was absolutely insane to watch people grind an area's fates for hours upon hours in order to receive just one item. The real kick in the ass though was the fact that there wasn't even a stat boost for doing this. All this did was prepare your weapon for the next 2 ranks in the quest line. Animus was a little more straightforward. It required you to buy 9 separate books using tomestones, something like 1 book at a time, and then you'd need to complete various tasks listed within the books in order to finish them. This wasn't so much of a random grind, but just a straightforward grinding process. Each book required you to kill 10 separate monsters, complete 3 specific dungeons, 3 fates, and 3 love quests. I remember heavily grinding the Dungeon Wanderer's Palace due to how fast it was possible to get through its entirety, making tomestone grinding a bit easier than normal. You literally had a tank grab all of the mobs from the start of the dungeon to the first boss and then hold them right at the outskirts of the boss's arena until it closes off, meaning you essentially bypass multiple fights along the way. Finally, the Novus quest line required you to create a sphere scroll for your weapon via some items purchased with tomestones. The scroll was then used as a blueprint for crafting your weapon into Novus status. This is where players began to gain freedom in customizing the secondary stats of their weapon. Players would have 3 main stats to work with, depending on the weapon. For Thyrus, the White Mage weapon, these were Piety, Determination, and Skill Speed. Or spell speed, sorry. After so many melds for a specific stat, it would raise a tier and lower the success rate of future melds. A raised tier meant players would need to start using higher grades of specific materia required. This was not only a time sink potentially, but a large gil sink as materia was harder to come by back in 2.0 than it is now. You couldn't even simply meld it. You actually needed another special item to complete each meld called Alexandrite, which was acquired through fates, purchased using allied seals which didn't even exist yet, or through treasure maps. Once the weapon was fully melded, it would be ascended to Novus Zodiac status. Patch 2.3 Defenders of Eorzea was released on the 8th of July 2014 and came with new quests, side quests, trials, and more. Let's bang a few of these out right away. The main scenario quest obviously continued here as it was a major patch. On top of that, it also included the 3rd installment of the Hildebrand questline, as well as another special questline involving a delivery Moogle. Nothing too crazy about these, they were just short and sweet quests that could sometimes offer minions or glamours. New dungeons included Hullbreaker Isle, an island off of Lanoska known for having multiple ships crash into it, as well as pirate treasure somewhere within. Hard modes were also added for Tom Tara Deepcroft and Stone Vigil respectively. For trials, this patch introduced a new primal, Rama, as a fight with both a hard and extreme mode releasing at the same time. I didn't mention it, but for clarification, you needed to complete the less difficult trial in order to unlock the extreme version. You couldn't just do the extreme version. An interesting inclusion into raiding specifically is the turns within the second Coil of Bahamut receiving Savage modes. I believe this would be the first inclusion of Savage, which is is a difficulty level reserved specifically for raids. It was clearly a trial process within 2.3 for multiple reasons. The first of which being that while the fight was exceptionally more difficult in comparison to the normal raids, it didn't actually offer any better rewards or higher level gear, instead being tied directly to the normal reward system from the normal second coil turns. Players also had to have fully completed the second coil of Bahamut to even attempt this new Savage mode. Additionally, the next tier of raids later on within a Realm Reborn wouldn't even have Savage, but later on in Heaven's Ward, it would make its return as a difficulty level and would begin to normalize. The second of 3 parts for the Crystal Tower 24-man were also released in 2.3. The name Circus Tower was a play off of the fact that Crystal Tower in Final Fantasy III was also known as Circus Tower. Players continued to fight Final Fantasy III monsters like Zonde, who was a boss within that entry. For housing, the major addition in this patch was for players within an FC to be able to purchase private chambers that they could customize freely. This was beneficial for many, as at this point there wasn't any personal housing for players to purchase for themselves. A 6th ward was also added to make more plots accessible for other free companies. 2.38 allowed players to finally ride mounts within residential districts, and also added a 7th and 8th ward to make room for personal housing, which was also released in this patch, meaning players could now buy personal plots of land for themselves without the need for an FC. For PvP, Frontline was finally added, which allows parties of 24 to face off against 2 other groups in player versus player combat. These take place in arenas of a much larger scale than normal, allowing players to use mounts outside of combat, and similar to normal PvP, their non-PvP abilities are restricted in favor of using PvP specific skills. The Hunt, which I mentioned earlier, was made available as well, which functioned as a type of bounty hunting endeavor. Think Final Fantasy XII if you ever played that one. Essentially, players could take marked bills from their grand company, which would outline specific generic monsters to defeat, and when defeated, the player would be rewarded with allied seals that could be used for various things. Now, there were also elite marks which came in B, A, and S ranks. Some of these appeared at specific times, some randomly, and these were special fights that generally required large groups similar to a Fate in order to defeat, but would have increased rewards. Chocobo raising was a new mechanic implemented as well that allowed players to stable their chocobo after completing a specific quest to unlock the functionality. Stables need to be placed on estate grounds in the residential ward, meaning players either needed to use one via their FC or their own personal one if they managed to get a plot of land. This allows players who haven't fully ranked their chocobo up to do so more easily, up to a maximum rank of 10. However, once at 10, players can feed their chocobo with a Varian Onion in order to raise the maximum rank by 1 and begin training again. This can be done up to a new maximum of rank 20. Players could even feed their chocobo a combination of snacks while they are stabled in order to change their color, but the combinations can be fairly specific and feel almost random, thus making the use of online guides highly recommended. For crafters, a new mechanic called Desynthesis was added, in which many items like equipment, furniture, etc. could be broken down into randomized items that made up the base parts of the original. Desynthesizing items that pertain to a specific crafting class would raise the level of said class up to a maximum of 100. However, at the time, there were only 300 skill points available, meaning you had to decide how you wanted to allot them by desynthesizing specific types of items. 2.38 also introduced the next stage of relic weapons, turning Novus Zodiac relics into Nexus tier. The main goal of this tier was to acquire light by completing normal content, such as dungeons, trials, fates, etc. The level of light obtained would range from 8 to 128, and players needed a total of 2,000 to finish their weapon. Patch 2.4 released on the 28th of October 2014 with the obvious MSQ additions and another Hildebrand questline. More importantly, this patch added a brand new DPS class that didn't require an expansion to access. The main theme of this patch was ice and snow, which was a lead up to the theming of the first expansion. Players would visit a new snowy dungeon and even fight an iconic ice-based primal. Rogue was a brand new class added that could be accessed in Limsa Lominsa. Unlike your typical class, you couldn't start as a rogue and could only unlock the class as long as you had at least one other class at level 10. It would transition into the ninja job, and both the class and job focused on fast attacks via dual wielding daggers, with the ninja unlocking the ability to use jutsus as well. One of the scions, Thancred, would actually take up this class through the storyline. One thing that makes this class unique isn't its mechanics, although they are very interesting, but but the fact that it was added via a patch and not included within an expansion. Every other class so far, except for Blue Mage, which is a special case, was added at the start of an expansion, but Rogue was essentially a brand new class for free. This class would also have its own potential relic become available through the Zodiac system. The main new dungeon in this expansion was Snowcloak, which, as the name implies, features the snow-filled setting within a giant ice wall that houses a character known as Iceheart, as well as her followers. Additional dungeons included hard mode Sastasha, one of the first dungeon players ever run in the series, and the Sunken Temple of Karn. The major featured trial for this patch was XIV Amphitheater, hard and extreme, where players would face off against Shiva, another iconic summon from the Final Fantasy series. Not only that, but there was also another trial unlocked via the Hildebrand questline called the Dragon's Neck, and had players face off against Ultros and Typhon, who were both recurring enemies from Final Fantasy. 2.4 brought with it the final set of raids for A Realm Reborn, accurately titled The Final Coil of Bahamut, also consisting of only 4 turns. This was the finale within the Coil storyline and would allow players to get some of the best equipment in the game at the time. In 2.45, the Nexus Zodiac weapons, which sat at eye level 115, could finally be upgraded to the eye level 125 Zodiac Brave series. This questline mostly functioned as a large gathering endeavor, with players needing to complete multiple quests that required them to purchase or find a large multitude of items. Once complete, players wouldn't be able to upgrade again until the final tier was released within one of the final patches of A Realm Reborn. Some final notes for this patch include the Duty Finder adding in withdrawal consequences. If players get matched for an instance and decline the notification multiple times, they could see a penalty cooldown applied to them, and they wouldn't be able to participate in matched instances until it expired. Additionally, entering into a matched instance and leaving would offer the same effect. The Duty Finder would also finally begin to list which duties you had selected at the bottom window. This allowed players to select up to 5 duties, not roulettes, and be placed into the first one available. Finally, tombstones were updated once again, deprecating mythology, making soldiery unlimited, fully removing philosophy, and introducing one of the most long-lasting tombstone currencies still available in the game today, poetics. Generally speaking, as expansions and content get fairly old, poetics end up being the main source of getting older items and have modern uses for various tasks within the game. Patch 2.5 was released January 20th, 2015, and contained within it one of the best of A Realm Reborn storyline, in my opinion. Now, I haven't gotten into it much, but generally speaking, A Realm Reborn storyline is a bit of a slog, to the point that there's even a purchasable item that lets you skip it. A lot of players will tell you that the game really starts to get good afterwards, starting in Heaven's Ward, but I don't exactly agree with that. Even with the storyline quests being a bit slow and bloated, the actual content you participate in, especially late into A Realm Reborn's life, is really good. You can tell that the developers were really hitting their stride when it came to designing a lot of the content later on. There definitely were a lot of issues with A Realm Reborn, especially the density of the storyline quests, to the point that they actually cut some of them out in future expansions. Or a favorite memory of mine is constantly walking the long way to the Waking Sands whenever Minfilia needs to ask you to gather 5 items or something, or, kill this thing, run this dungeon, etc. It was the absolute worst trek in the game because there was no aetheryte near the location for her secret base, and it was an even worse feeling having completed all of the quests that ever take you there, only to find out later that you could have just taken a ferry from Lindsay Lominza to the Waking Sands directly. I'm sorry. So yes, the game definitely has its issues, but I say all this to bring up that 2.5 was truly a fantastic climax for everything A Realm Reborn offered and had been building up to, and it was all thanks to one set of cutscenes. Like, if you see this warning that should be on the screen before a cutscene in this game, you know that it's going to be an absolute banger. And near the end of 2.5, this was one of the first times you saw it. It's long, full of intrigue, people die, or die in air quotes, since a lot of characters come back in the series, and it was this huge dramatic shift from what A Realm Reborn had been and into what it was going to be within Heaven's Ward, having you built up into a hero and then taking it all away from you so that you're at rock bottom. It was a fantastic finale for the storyline, and I highly recommend not skipping A Realm Reborn for this patch alone. Also, they added a 5th chapter to Hildebrand here and more delivery Moogle stuff. Okay. For dungeons, one of my absolute favorites in A Realm Reborn was a release called Keeper of the Lake, where players would traverse a large tower to face off against the dragon Midgard Swarmer. I just remember the final fight in this being really engaging and just having a really great time overall. On top of this, Wanderer's Palace and Ampedor Keep received hard modes. New trials included a special fight against Odin known as Earth's Font, another Hildebrand specific trial called Battle in the Big Keep, and a very unique trial known as Steps of Faith. Earth's Font shouldn't be confused with the fate where you fight Odin. Instead, this is a dedicated boss trial against him with its own set of mechanics and rewards. Meanwhile, Battle in the Big Keep had players facing off against Gilgamesh again for a second time, and Steps of Faith was by far one of the most unique fights in the early series. It specifically had players defending this large bridge found in Coerthas from a giant dragon that would move slowly towards it. Players had to fight the dragon, deal with mobs, and also try to slow the dragon down using various cannons on top of towers that could snare it. The final tier of the Crystal Tower was also released, dubbed World of Darkness, based off of the location from Final Fantasy III. This series of fights would culminate in the players facing off against Cloud of Darkness, the final boss from the same game, and ending the Crystal Tower series. One of the absolute coolest additions in 2.51 had to be the introduction of the Manderville Gold Saucer, based off of the Gold Saucer from Final Fantasy VII. Just like 7, the Gold Saucer here is essentially a giant casino, amusement park, arcade, with various features that players can take part in to earn special currency known as MGP. Multiple features were included, such as chocobo racing, which allowed players to raise and race the chocobos, which they could level up and retire later on to help breed even better chocobos for future races. The races themselves function like something out of a Mario Kart entry with worse controls. You can apply abilities to your chocobo to use mid-race or even grab abilities as items while on the track. Players have to manage their stamina actively while racing. Triple Triad from Final Fantasy VIII, I think, was also introduced and plays as you would expect, with players able to gain cards in a multitude of ways, some even dropping in the 24-man raids or retroactively being added to old dungeons, making them worthwhile to run for the collectors out there. There was a lottery system and scratch ticket system created as well. The Jumbo Cactpot would allow you to choose a unique sequence of numbers and see if you won at the time of the numbers being called, while Mini Cactpot was more of a short minigame where you attempted to select a row or column or diagonal within a value that corresponded with the best winnings possible. It sounds confusing and I'm not going to get into detail about it, but it's actually pretty easy, though most people use online calculators to figure out the best chance of winning the most amount of money, or MGP. You know what I mean. Gates are a set of scheduled minigames that players can take part in. They're all unique and offer decent MGP upon completion. Finally, there's also many small little minigame machines that cost virtually nothing to play and offer virtually nothing in return. One final thing I want to touch on that was a nice attention to detail was seeing the hub area of Mordona upgrade slightly with each patch. It would slowly gain new scaffolding and structures as the game updated and allowed for various areas to become accessible through odd jumping mechanics that were not intended. Now there's other little things added here and there within this patch, such as a new frontline map, but I believe this covers all of the major aspects of 2.5, and with that, all major aspects of 2.0 as a whole. I don't think it's impossible to go over everything within an MMO, but I do think it's outside the scope of this video, which is already 40 pages long. Do you remember when I said it was 8 pages long? It's 40 pages long now. That being said, I feel as though most major features have at least been discussed and brought to light in some capacity, and hopefully you learned a little something along the way. A lot of this information, if not all of it, comes straight from the patch notes, which are well documented on the Final Fantasy XIV website, or public wikis like Console Gamers that help provide an easy resource for finding out a lot about old content. Final Fantasy XIV is one of my favorite games, one I've been playing off and on since 2.0's release, and I've had a lot of great experiences within it. I've made a lot of friends through the game, grown throughout the game, and even introduced some friends to it. 2.0 specifically will always hold a special place in my heart because I was there for essentially the start, watching people discover new things, deal with questionable design choices, and advance as a community. I remember people finding out you could climb specific sections of Mordona so that you could make it to the top of the ropes that hung from there, and I remember everyone attempting to do so all the time for a good portion of whichever patch introduced that. Those little things are always some of the best aspects of MMOs, and something you can look forward to. If you were ever considering getting into Final Fantasy XIV, now is a great time because the game is stronger and more popular than it ever has been. In the next video, we'll be going over Final Fantasy XIV's first real expansion, Heaven's Ward, starting with patch 3.0. This expansion is particularly notable for introducing the flying mechanic. If you enjoy these videos and want to see more, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. If you like Monster Hunter, I have plenty of history videos on that particular subject, and I highly recommend checking them out. That's all I have for you guys today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Hello, you made it to the end of the video. Thank you so much. This video was like an hour and 40 minutes, so it really took a while to get done, but I appreciate it. You're in the Patreon section where I thank people for pledging on Patreon. If you want to pledge on Patreon, you can do so down below by clicking the link in the description. We should have some names for the certain pledge ranks here, and I will be shouting out the highest pledge ranks specifically, so here we go. Grimblow7, aka Nick, thank you so much for the G rank tier, really appreciate it. Beyond the Time, thank you so much for the G rank tier. Christopher, thank you so much for the G rank tier. Nolan Brookman, thank you so much for the G rank tier. IBM 200, thank you so much for the G rank tier. Pergunner Erickson, thank you so much for the G rank tier. Atomic Weapon, thank you. Karen Tall, thank you. Carl the Crab, thank you. Mo Al Kasemi, thanks. We Do a Little Gaming, thank you so much. Captain Ziba or Zyba, thank you so much. Cyberworm, thank you so much for the G rank tier. They're all G rank tiers. I don't know why I had to think about that. Mogbit, thank you for the G rank tier. Kathleen Medjuk, thank you so much for the G rank tier. Crunchy Cowroo, thank you so much for the G rank tier. Jonathan, thank you so much for the G rank tier. Strangely, thank you so much for the G rank tier. Ben VB, thank you so much for the G rank tier, really appreciate it. Lud Hafumi, thank you so much for the G rank tier, it's awesome. So super poggers, very pog based. Rosal Leo, thank you so much for the G rank tier. Justin Regal, thank you so much for the G rank tier. And Mr. Janky, thank you for the G rank tier. Appreciate it, guys. Hopefully you liked the video. If you did, let me know. I'll probably be working on the Heaven's Ward video at some point. Might work on something else in the meantime. We'll see. And thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.